Hey all, welcome to your first lesson in Unit 4 on learning. This lesson is going to focus on classical conditioning, although we're going to touch on some of the topics that are going to come later in the unit as well. So first we're going to start with what is learning. Learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. The emphasis here is on enduring. Learning is very, very different from cramming, where you remember something for just a short amount of time and then you don't remember it later. To truly learn is to own the knowledge, the skill, or idea. So some ways that we learn, we learn to expect and prepare for significant events, such as food or pain. That's classical conditioning. And I'm going to show you some really cool, fun video clips in class on some of these differences to help you have a real concrete example. We learn to repeat acts that bring rewards and avoid acts that bring unwanted results. That's operant conditioning, which is the next lesson. We learn by observing events and people. That's observational learning. And we learn things we have neither experienced or observed, which is cognitive learning. So associative learning, learning that certain events occur together. These events may be two stimuli, such as in classical conditioning, or a response and its consequence, such as in operant conditioning, and the associations may be positive or negative. So how do positive associations factor in learning? Well, we tend to connect positive events when they occur in sequence. If you hung out with a new group of classmates during lunch and have a great time laughing, the next time that group asks you to join them for lunch, you'll associate them with fun and good times, and more than likely eagerly agree to meet up with them. Negative associations factor learning. So when we tend to connect negative events when they occur, events when they occur in sequence. So if you put your hand on a hot stove and the heat burns you and causes you pain, you'll now know to associate that stove with pain and be more careful the next time. That's how we learn. So what are two types of associative learning? There's classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We are going to focus this lesson on classical and the next lesson on operant. So we learn to associate two stimuli and thus to anticipate events. Stimuli are things we do not control and that we respond automatically to, involuntary responses. Operant conditioning, we learn to associate a response, which is our behavior, and its consequence. The behavior is voluntary. We operate on the environment to produce a consequence. How do associations lead to habits? So learned associations also feed our habitual behaviors. The reason so many of us eat popcorn in the movie theater, for example, is that we've come to associate the movie theater with buttery popcorn. For some, that habit is hard to break. Enter a movie theater and bam, all of a sudden you want to eat a ton of popcorn. How do associations lead to habituation? So other animals learn by association. Disturbed by a squirt of water, the sea slug, Aplysia, protectively withdraws its gill. If the squirts continue, as happens naturally in choppy water, the withdrawal response diminishes. We say the slug habituates. But if the sea slug repeatedly received an electric shock just after being squirted, its protective response to the squirt instead grows stronger. The animal has associated the squirt with the impending shock. So what is habituation? It's what happens when repeated stimulation produces waning responsiveness. So in the case of the sea slug, he got used to the squirts from the choppy waters, just as you might get used to cold ocean water after you've been in for a while. Exam tip number 1. The exam could have you differentiate similar concepts from various units. For example, it's easy to confuse habituation with sensory adaptation, right? That was what we studied in the last unit, where you get used to a sense. So like a strong smell, for example, if you're cooking and you get used to that strong smell, is different from habituation. So how do those two things differ? Habituation is a type of learning or relatively permanent change in behavior that involves a reduced response as a result of repeated but not constant exposure, whereas sensory adaptation is a perceptual phenomenon that occurs when the brain stops recognizing a constant and unchanging stimulus, such as the strong smell. So what's a stimulus? We've talked about this before, so this is review. A stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. So for example, with the sea slug, the stimulus was the squirt from the choppy ocean waters or the electric shock from the researcher. For the popcorn eater, the stimulus was the movie theater environment that created a desire to eat popcorn. A response is the behavior that follows the stimulus. So again, in the sea slug response, the involuntary behavior, which is classical conditioning, was the shirking. For the popcorn eater, the voluntary behavior was the purchasing and eating of popcorn. So how is classical conditioning defined exactly? So classical conditioning is a type of associative learning that involves learned involuntary responses. So we associate stimuli that we do not control and we respond automatically, exhibiting respondent behavior. Involuntary responses include salivation, blinking, sweating, and cringing, or the automatic bodily reactions to strong emotions such as fear. So how does classical conditioning occur? So it could be two related events. Stimulus number one is lightning. Stimulus number two is thunder. Response, startled reaction of wincing. So we learn that a flash of lightning signals an impending crack of thunder. So these two events typically occur together and in sequence. So we associate thunderbolts with lightning, very, very frightening. Because we have associated lightning with thunder, we expect to have one when we have the other. So upon seeing a crash of lightning, we automatically respond by tensing and anticipating the loud thunder boom. Operant conditioning is when we learn to associate a response, our voluntary behavior, and its consequence. So in contrast to classical, this is voluntary, not involuntary. So we and other animals learn to repeat voluntary acts followed by good results and avoid voluntary acts followed bad results. These associations produce operant behaviors, which operate on the environment to produce a consequence. That's a good way to remember that. So here's how it works. We learn that a voluntary behavior or response of politeness, for example, is associated with the consequence of receiving a cookie. The next time the opportunity presents itself, we repeat the voluntary behavior that had the positive consequence the last time. We associate the behavior with the consequence. This is how dogs learn to take a treat. They learn that if they sit, they do this behavior, that they will then get a consequence of a treat. So what are respondent behaviors and what are operant behaviors? Respondent behaviors are those that occur as an automatic response to some stimulus. So that was like the woman tensing for the thunder boom. Operant behaviors are those that operate on the environment producing consequences. So like the kids saying please or a dog begging for a treat. So do classical and operant conditioning work together? Yes, they do. So we're going to consider the Japanese cattle ranch where the clever rancher outfitted his herd with electronic pagers, which he called from his cell phone. After a week of training, the animals learned to associate two stimuli, the beep of their pager and the arrival of food. So that was classical conditioning. But they also learned to associate their hustling to the food trough with the pleasure of eating. That is operant conditioning, which ended up simplifying the rancher's work altogether. So what is behaviorism's view of learning? So we're going back to the beginning of our studies, and we're going to tie back in behaviorism, and we're going to bring back a name, not a new name, but we're going to bring back a name. So according to John B. Watson, the science of psychology should study how organisms respond to stimuli in their environments. Psychology's goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods. Simply said, psychology should be an objective science based on observable behavior. And another person we're going to bring back, and we did not go very deeply with Pavlov, but we are going to with this lesson, Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov's work laid the foundation for many of John Watson's ideas. Both believed the basic laws of learning were the same for all animals, whether sea slugs, dogs, or humans. Pavlov spent 2 decades studying dogs' digestive systems and ended up earning the Nobel Prize for it. His experiments on learning produced the phenomena we call classical conditioning that we just went over. So here's his initial work. Pavlov attached a tube in the dog's cheek to collect saliva, which was measured in a cylinder outside the chamber. Without fail, putting food in a dog's mouth caused the animal to salivate, but, and this is cool, the dog began salivating not only to the taste of the food, but also to the mere sight of the food, or even the food dish, or the person delivering the food, or even at the sound of that person's approaching footsteps. Pavlov realized this behavior pointed to a simple but fundamental form of learning. So, here we're going to look at before conditioning, and then during conditioning and after conditioning. So, before conditioning, food in mouth, salivating. We have a tone. I'm going over from left to right on the top. So now we have a tone, no salivation. We have a tone plus the food, the bowl of food, salivation. We have the tone after conditioning because it was associated with the food, now equals salivation. So starting over from the beginning, an unconditioned response, which is the US, produces an unconditioned response. A neutral response or a neutral stimulus produces no salivation. The unconditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented just after the no salivation response. And the unconditioned stimulus continues to produce the UR, which is the unconditioned response. So then when you ring the tone, the dog produces saliva because it associates it with the food. So how are the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response related? So food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally triggers a dog's salivary reflex. No training is required for this automatic involuntary response. Pavlov called this reflex an unconditioned response, right? It makes sense. He called the food the unconditioned stimulus. You see food, you're going to have an unconditioned response. You're going to salivate. The neutral stimulus is the tone or the bell when activated produces no response. Pavlov called the bell tuning fork, the buzzer, the neutral stimulus. On its own, it produced no response. So what happens in a conditioning trial? Pavlov conducted multiple trials pairing the neutral stimulus, the NS, of the tone with the unconditioned stimulus of the food. The US of the food, though, is what actually continues to produce the unconditioned response of the drool and salivation. So what are the conditioned response and conditioned stimulus then? So salivation in response to a tone, however, is learned. It is conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food, right? That makes sense. This response is the conditioned response. The neutral stimulus that now triggers salivation is the continued stimulus. AP exam tip number 2. Understanding the components of Pavlov's classical conditioning is definitely important on the AP exam. Practice with scenarios and make sure you can identify the USCS, NSUR, and CR, and we will definitely be doing that in class. So, what is acquisition? In classical conditioning, the initial stage when one links a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned involuntary response, that is acquisition. In operant conditioning, the strengthening of a reinforced response or the decreasing of a punished response is acquisition relating to operant conditioning. So acquisition has 2 meanings depending on whether we're talking about classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Is onion breath attractive? It can be. Onion breath does not usually produce sexual arousal, but when repeatedly paired with a passionate kiss, it can become a conditioned stimulus and do just that. How does classical conditioning support reproduction? So just before presenting an approachable female quail, researchers turned on a red light. Over time, the red light signaled the male quail to become excited. Conditioning helps an animal survive and reproduce by responding to cues that help it gain food, avoid dangers, locate mates, and produce offspring. What is higher order conditioning? So a procedure in classical conditioning in which the conditioned stimulus in one conditioning experience is paired with a new neutral stimulus, creating a second, often weaker conditioned stimulus. For example, an animal that has learned that a tone predicts food might then learn that a light predicts the tone and begin responding to the light alone. That's also called a second order conditioning, which is pretty cool. So what if the US is no longer presented? Pavlov wondered if the tone sounded again and again, but no food appear, would the tone still trigger the salivation? So how does extinction occur? When an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a conditioned stimulus. So in this case, when food no longer follows the bell, extinction happens. What is spontaneous recovery? Well, it's exactly what you might think it is, the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditional response. Extinction and spontaneous recovery are two terms that frequently appear on the AP exam. We're not talking about extinction in terms of dinosaurs. So it's key that you establish extinction has occurred before spontaneous recovery. In other words, make sure the reader of your FRQ knows the conditioned stimulus, the bell, no longer produces the conditioned response, the drool or the salivation. Then a pause occurs of days or weeks. Then spontaneously, the conditioned response occurs again without any relearning or repairing with the US, which is the food, the stimulus. All right, what is generalization? So the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. So if Pavlov's dog learned to salivate to a tone, and the researcher then rang a bell or played a note on a flute, it may be that the dog drools to these stimuli as well. We would say that the dog had generalized his response to the stimulus. How did Pavlov demonstrate generalization? So, Pavlov attached miniature vibrators to various parts of the dog's body. After conditioning salivation to stimulation of the thigh, he stimulated other areas. The closer a stimulated spot was to the dog's thigh, the stronger the conditioned response became. All right, what is discrimination? Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and a similar stimuli that does not signal an unconditioned response. So, if Pavlov only presented the food after the bell, but not the tone, the tuning fork, or the buzzer, the dog would learn to discriminate between the sounds and only drool, the conditioned response, to the bell. Why does Pavlov's work remain so important? Well, because he taught us that significant psychological phenomena can be studied objectively, and that classical conditioning is a basic form of learning that applies to all species, which is so cool. What have been some applications of Pavlov's work to human health and well-being? So former drug users often feel a craving when they're again in the drug using context, with people or in places they associate with previous highs. People who struggle with their weight often have eaten unhealthy foods thousands of times, leaving them with strongly conditioned responses to eat the very foods that will keep them in poor health. When a particular taste accompanies a drug that influences immune responses, the taste by itself may come to produce an immune response. How did Watson apply Pavlov's principles to learned fears? So Pavlov's work also provided a basis for Watson's idea that human emotions and behaviors, though biologically influenced, are mainly a bundle of conditioned responses. So Watson applied classical conditioning principles in his studies of little Albert, which we're going to talk about in class, to demonstrate how specific fears might be conditioned. What did Watson and Rayner do? John B. Watson and his grad assistant Rosalie Rayner conditioned little Albert to fear a white rat after repeatedly experiencing a loud noise as the rat was presented. How did little Albert learn to fear rats? Well, after 7 repeats of seeing the rat and hearing the frightening noise, Albert burst into tears at the mere sight of the rat. Poor little guy. How did little Albert generalize his learning? 5 days later, he generalized the startled fear reaction to the sight of a rabbit, a dog, and a sealskin coat, but not to dissimilar objects such as toys. So he generalized his fear by looking at other animals that were similar to the rat.